My students often find me to be eccentric. They're not too surprised that I have an interest in music theory and that I have favorite music theory books and favorite music theorists. They're more surprised to find out that I have a keen interest in the visual arts and that I have favorite artists and art historians. I have favorite writers and literary critics, favorite philosophers and computer scientists. I even have a favorite sociologist. His name is Howard Becker. In his book, What About Mozart? What About Murder? Becker talks about the killer question. That's the question that people ask not to get an answer, but just to shut you up. It's not really a question at all, but a coded statement so powerful that there can be no response. In his book, Art Worlds, Becker proposed that works of art are not the products of individual artists, but rather the result of community effort. The killer question, what about Mozart, was meant to refute that idea. As everybody knows, Mozart was such a great genius that he didn't need anybody else's help, and even if he did, nobody else could work on his level. I'd like to return to the idea of music as a collaborative process later, but first I'd like to talk about the conception of Mozart as a great composer, as a great man. The study of music in the modern university is based on the idea of the great man theory. The great man theory stipulates that all of the music that is really valuable was created by a handful of great men, and only by studying their works can we truly understand music. Today, we can find lots of things wrong with the great man theory. We can object to it on the grounds that it's gender biased, and culturally biased, and elitist. But it's held on because it promises to teach best practices. If we want to learn to do something well, like compose music, don't we want to learn from the best examples? The name the great man theory implies that some people are not just a little bit better at doing certain things than other people, but miles better. After all, it's not called the pretty good man theory or the slightly better than average man theory. When I was in college, I would occasionally play hooky with a few of my friends and go to the racetrack. I was living in Louisville, Kentucky, which meant that we usually went to Churchill Downs. Churchill Downs is a very pleasant place to spend a beautiful spring or fall afternoon, and I enjoyed these outings very much, even though I wasn't particularly interested in gambling. I wasn't particularly interested in gambling because it's very difficult to determine exactly which horse is going to win. There was always a top group of horses that were pretty evenly matched, and when the race was over, one of these horses had won the race by a small margin. These margins were often so small that any horse could have won the race given slightly different circumstances. The outcome was a fluke, and if it was a fluke, it was impossible to predict which horse was actually going to win. So much for the great horse theory. And then, in 1973, there was Secretariat. Secretariat was a horse that won the Kentucky Derby. I was not at the track that day. As a local, I avoided the track on Derby Day. It's too crowded and it's too expensive. Still, I watched Secretariat's win on television, and on our old fuzzy black and white TV, at the end of the race, all I saw was Secretariat. The bunching up of all the horses so familiar from my days at the track just didn't show up on my television screen. At the end of the race, it was as if Secretariat were running the race by himself. He won the race by 2.5 lengths. This is a respectable margin, especially in a high-stakes race like the Kentucky Derby. The astonishing thing about Secretariat's win is that at the end of the race, he was still accelerating. The Kentucky Derby is 1.25 miles, and he was running as if he wasn't even tired. He set a track record, and he was the first horse to win the Kentucky Derby in under 2 minutes. Still, maybe his Kentucky Derby win was a fluke. In order to prove the great horse theory valid, he would have to win 2 more races, the Preakness Stakes and the Belmont Stakes, the 2 remaining races in the so-called Triple Crown. Secretariat also won the Preakness by 2.5 lengths, beating the same horse as in the Kentucky Derby. He set a record for the race. His competition was equally tough. The second-place horse also set a record for the race. Naysayers expected Secretariat to fail in the Belmont. No horse had won the Triple Crown in 35 years. Many people thought it was impossible. The Belmont is also a longer race. At a mile and a half, surely Secretariat would run out of steam. But he didn't. He won the race by 31 lengths. Our local newspaper ran a large photograph of the race on the front page the next day. Secretariat was the only horse in the picture. In fact, only 4 horses ran in the race. Practically nobody wanted to run against him. Under those circumstances, you would have thought that he would have relaxed and accepted an easy victory. He didn't. He set a record for the race, and he ran the fastest mile and a half ever, beating the old record by 2 seconds. Secretariat was the real deal. He was the great horse that makes the great horse theory plausible. But what about the great man theory? Is Mozart so much better than other composers that it seems like they're not even in the same race? It's hard to judge winners and losers in artistic endeavors. Criteria for artistic judgment are arbitrary, so I suggest that we start with none. Let's just pick pieces by 2 different composers and compare them. If the pieces are similar, then we should assume that the composers have a similar level of skill. If they're different, then we should assume, well, something else. I've picked the composer Ditters von Dittersdorf to run against Mozart. Dittersdorf was a very successful composer in his own day, arguably more successful than Mozart, and he achieved a level of success that eluded Mozart. He was elevated to the aristocracy. I must confess that one of the reasons I selected Dittersdorf is that I like his name. It amuses my students, some of whom have accused me of making it up to get a laugh in class. His name was not always Ditters von Dittersdorf, but was originally simply Ditters. When he became an aristocrat, his benefactor renamed a small village in his honor, so that he could have a seat, a place over which he could rule. Ditters von Dittersdorf's most successful work was the comic opera, The Doctor and Apothecary. Let's take a look at the overture from that opera. The overture starts with 3 measures of repeated Ds. This serves as a kind of introduction to the first theme. This theme has a number of simple modular ideas. The first one consists of 16ths, Ds with lower neighbor C sharps. This is followed by repeated subdominant chords that resolve to tonic. This module with the 16th notes and repeated subdominant chords repeats twice more. This is followed by another module which has a 16th note accompaniment. Tonic, supertonic, subdominant, and dominant chords are placed above this with a prominent dotted 8th 16th note figure. This module has 2 4-measure phrases, the first ending in a deceptive cadence, the second ending in an authentic cadence. The first and second modules are repeated, except the second module is now half as long and ends on an authentic cadence in D. The second theme follows immediately without an episode of going to music. The second theme is characterized by prominent sforzandos and scale passages and staccato notes. It is initially made up of 2 4-measure phrases, the first of which ends on a half cadence, the second of which ends on an authentic cadence. These phrases are repeated, except at the end a modulation occurs. A G sharp pivots the passage into A major. There's an episode of going to music and a closing theme. The exposition draws to a close. The middle section of the piece, which in sonata form would be a development, presents entirely new material. Not only is the material in this section new, it's not even developmental. It isn't even going to music. Dittersdorf gives us a dance-like binary form with a coda at the end. This whole section is in the dominant, and it ends on an A7 chord that leads easily back to the tonic key of D for the recap. The recap is just like the exposition until the last part of the first theme. At that point, the first theme modulates to the subdominant. The second theme appears in the subdominant. It modulates at its end to tonic, and the rest of the piece is just like the end of the exposition, except in tonic and with a coda tacked on. The modulation coming out of the second theme is just like the one in the exposition, but transposed. The exposition goes from D to a modulation up a fifth. The recap goes from G to D, a modulation up a fifth. In order to compare Dittersdorf to Mozart, we need to find a work by Mozart similar to the Doctor and Apothecary Overture. This work would need to be popular, preferably from a comic opera. The Overture from the Magic Flute fits these criteria. It was written for a commercial theater, not the court opera, and it was a popular success. Mozart's Overture starts with a fairly lengthy, slow, dramatic introduction. Mozart's first theme starts at the allegro. Like the Dittersdorf theme, this theme has multiple sections. The first part is 6 repeated eighth notes on a single pitch, followed by a kind of turn figure in 16th notes. This is repeated immediately up a fifth. The second section of the theme consists of 2 measures of eighth notes, repeated pitches forming a 6, a 2, and a 5 chord. This entire theme is repeated up a fifth as a second voice. At the same time, the previous voice continues as a countermelody. This countermelody introduces some new ideas, held sforzando notes that resolve on the 4th beat, and scale passages. This time the theme has a 3-measure extension, where the lower voice takes over the repeated eighth note pattern that ends the theme, while the first voice does the sforzando notes. A descending scale is added to both voices at the end. A third voice enters with the theme, in the tonic key, while the other voices continue with countermelodies. A fourth voice enters in the bass, in the dominant. The opening of this allegro section follows the form of a fugal exposition, with each voice entering separately with a statement of the theme, the fugue subject. After this exposition, Mozart brings back what looks like the theme one more time. I say that this is the theme, but it is in fact truncated. The repeated eighth note 6-2-5 chords are missing at its end. These are replaced with ideas from the countermelody, the held sforzando note, and the descending scale. If this were a Bach-style fugue, the next section would be an episode of Going To Music, and that's exactly what we have. This would be followed by a middle entry, perhaps in the dominant. That's kind of what we have. The first measure of the theme is in the bass in B flat. There is a new idea in the upper voice that starts with a leap, followed by a descending scale or arpeggio. This material repeats a number of times and forms a harmonically stable section 10 measures long. This section is then repeated. That's 20 measures of arrived at music in the dominant. That looks like a second theme to me. So I would call this a second theme, even though this second theme contains material from the first theme. This is followed by Going To Music and a kind of closing figure that ends at a double bar. This allegro section looks and sounds like a Bach-style fugue, and yet it also has characteristics of sonata form. I think Mozart has blended the two together. If this is a sonata form, A development should follow the double bar. I think it does. The development starts with slow, dramatic chords reminiscent of the introduction. This is followed by an allegro that develops fragments of the theme and countermelody. This is all going to music. There's a grand pause. After this, the texture changes. Mozart creates a new melody from the opening of the theme and a descending scale. This is harmonized with a dominant seventh chord that moves to another dominant seventh chord at its end, which starts a transposed version of this idea, which ends on another dominant seventh chord. That starts another transposition of the idea. The idea is stated one more time over a B-flat dominant seventh chord. This leads back to the E-flat for a recapitulation. The recap starts out differently than the exposition. This should not be surprising. In addition to being a sonata form, this is a fugue, and fugues rarely have two expositions of the same theme. So the theme here is truncated. It doesn't contain the eighth note repeated 6-2-5 chords. It's actually like the statement of the theme that followed the entry of all four voices. It has the first measure of the theme and the sforzando note and descending scale from the counter melody. It's also a busier texture with more voices. And a section of going to music follows. What we call the second theme returns, but in the tonic key and transformed. This time the beginning of the first theme is in the upper voice, and the scale or arpeggio figure is revoiced. The rest of the overture is going to music and coda. These two pieces are radically different. I might be accused of stacking the deck, of picking these two pieces on purpose in order to prove my point. I assure you that I didn't. I had never heard the Dittersdorf piece before I analyzed it, and while I have heard the Mozart many times, and I've probably played it, I never paid much attention to it. Without criteria, it's difficult to rank the composers, but it is possible to show that they are different, and to show how they are different. The Dittersdorf is a very simple sonata form. It contains very little going to music and practically no development. In fact, there's so little development that even the development section doesn't develop the themes. Instead, Dittersdorf has inserted new material, a kind of binary dance form, in place of where the development should be. In a previous video, I have quoted A.B. Marx complaining that some composers will simply string 2 and 3 part forms together in order to create longer compositions. That's the kind of thing that Dittersdorf has done here. The Mozart is a very different kind of piece, and it's a very different kind of sonata form. It's a sonata form that makes use of the kinds of procedures typical of a Bach fugue. After an exposition where all 4 voices enter, the fugue consists of alternating sections of going to music with statements of the theme. One particular feature of the Mozart stands out in my mind. After the fugal exposition, there's a short section of going to music that rises to a climax. This is followed by an emphatic statement of the theme in the tonic key. This structure dramatizes the theme in a way that a standard fugal exposition does not. The fact that the texture continues to grow with each entrance of the theme suggests that the piece is building up to something else. And what would that something be? A strong statement of the theme. So does Mozart win the race by 31 lengths like Secretariat won the Belmont Stakes? I think he does, but I think that may be because they aren't even in the same race. And I would say that he has won, because what Mozart has done appeals to me and my 21st century college music teacher sensibilities. Mozart's music does what I like music to do. Dittersdorf, on the other hand, wrote a simpler kind of piece, the kind of piece that would appeal to people who really didn't care that much about music. Mozart was often criticized in his own day for writing for connoisseurs and not for the average listener. The Magic Flute Overture bears this out. The Magic Flute was a singspiel. It was the 18th century equivalent of a Broadway musical. What kind of composer would put a fugue in a Broadway musical? Well, I can think of one, Leonard Bernstein, but he was also not an average composer. I don't see Mozart winning the great man race because he appealed to people in his own time, but rather because he appeals to people today. Dittersdorf was more successful in his own time because he was appealing to people who were casual consumers of classical music. Those people are pretty much gone today. Consumers of classical music today are all connoisseurs. They are looking for things that are different than most people were in the 18th century. I'm amused when people tell me that they love music from the classical period. I assume that what they mean is that they love music by the great men, by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and not by composers like Dittersdorf. I would have to say that I really don't like the music of the classical period all that much, except for the music of these composers and a few others like them. I suspect that what I like about their music is some contemporary concern of mine that I'm projecting back onto their music, that I'm not really that enamored of 18th century music at all. So does this mean that we shouldn't perform or study the works of the great men? I think we should, because their works embody what we value about music. Does this mean that they weren't really great? I think they were. I think they were great at being themselves. Mozart was great at being Mozart, and Beethoven was great at being Beethoven, and I suppose that Dittersdorf was great at being Dittersdorf. But since we don't value the kinds of things that Dittersdorf was great at, like getting himself elevated to the aristocracy, we don't really care about him that much anymore. So this question, what about Mozart, boils down to what we value in music. In the next video, I'll discuss what we truly value in music.